Hey, welcome back to Overhead Athletics. Max Wardell here. I'm joined by Bennett. Bennett's one of our guys. He's already committed to play in college at Wayne State next year. As a dual player, he's playing a position and pitching, which is pretty awesome. He's left-handed. And a lot of times we're starting with our arm care assessment here, which gives us a nice quantitative look at arm strength in our throwing athletes, as well as their preparedness to throw. So go ahead and get going here. He can run through this thing. I did a podcast before with Dr. Ryan Croton, and we talked about this program. I like it quite a bit. It does not replace our manual muscle testing, and I have to emphasize that it does not replace our manual muscle testing, but it is a great adjunct to that, and that it can give us quantified numbers. It'll actually give us strength numbers and then ratios, which are really nice, as well as a tracking of progression. So that's pretty much what we use it for. Bennett here is just going to run through all the tests, and I'm going to talk a little bit. So we like to use it prior to throwing, after a warm-up, and I'm just kind of here. I let him run through it, making sure he's kind of lined up where he needs to be. And one of the biggest errors I see with this is people put the pad right under the shoulder. It should just go under the elbow so that they can relax that shoulder down a little bit, and it puts them a little bit more in the scapular plane. Now, he's just running through this assessment. I stress that this does not replace our manual muscle testing, because our manual muscle testing, we use reciprocal inhibition, where, say, we can turn off the posterior deltoid by activating, say, the anterior deltoid. So I reciprocally inhibit the posterior deltoid, and then I test external rotation strength. So I take the posterior deltoid out of it. So we're doing a lot of those things with our manual muscle testing, and that gives us key insight as clinicians, and I can test in various positions. When we use these tests, we try to standardize it, so we're testing always in the same position, and that's what I like, because it gives us a standardized approach that's objective, and we can come back and say, are we objectively better? We didn't change the test, if you will. When I'm looking for qualitative assessment of rotator cuff strength, I want to see how strong are you in this position, how strong are you here, and what about when I reciprocally inhibit another muscle that could be potentially contributing to this strength. So it takes us a few minutes to run through once he's got a handle on it, and it can really give us a good perspective on how fatigued he is and all of these other great metrics. And from here, we'll go into the throwing sock, which I know a lot of you guys are on this video to watch what we do with the throwing sock. So once we get through all 4 assessments, including the grip, then we go to the throwing sock. Now, I don't tend to use the app personally for range of motion, because as a physical therapist, I'm assessing range of motion on the table, and I can be pretty accurate in what I do there as far as making sure I pin the scapula and really looking at the range of motion. And this just gives us a great perspective on where he's at day to day, but also in how we're improving him over time. I do appreciate any quantifiable measures to look at arm strength in our throwing athletes. And now we'll move on to the throwing sock once he finishes his last test here, and we'll look at the way in which he throws, because it's very important to get him throwing in an effective manner. And what we found with Bennett particularly is that the throwing sock has been extremely effective in getting him to sequence his throw better, but also allow him to throw at a higher intensity with decreased discomfort in the arm. So if you look at Bennett's strength numbers here, we were really peaking in strength. He was going up in strength, and this is external rotation. One thing I like about the app, and then you can see he kind of dropped off. Now we were doing a lot of PT at this point. Now down to where we're at here, he's been doing a lot of exercising. He's been doing physical therapy and throwing, and he's probably overdoing it. It's a good way that we can kind of look at the trend of where he's at, and we can say, okay, where are you at compared to high school? Where are you at compared to college? He's probably overdoing it a little bit. We need to back him down a little bit in terms of his exercise so that he can tolerate more throwing as we prepare for the season. So we kind of have some of these measures. We'll look at the reports. We'll look at that stuff. And then we'll go into our throwing sock, because the throwing sock seems to work really well for Bennett. So I like to work on throwing mechanics at the same time. Now let's go ahead and get set here. So we'll get him pre-positioned wherever we want him, get loaded into the hip, and then we're just going to have him throwing from there. So big step and go. Now you have to pick a higher release point. And one thing with the throwing sock is I've seen that a lot of guys tend to pick a low release point. They try to throw it down. I want you to throw it high, like you're going to throw it at the top of the net there. Let's get set in that same position. So we can replicate the same release point. And what he's actually doing is he's throwing into the sock. And these are from Tap Conditioning, or Oats Specialties is the website you can purchase these on. They're pretty inexpensive. I use them with a lot of my athletes. We get them into the position that we want them. So we're pre-positioned. Remember that spot right there? Now throw it high. So now we can replicate a better release point. And what this throwing sock does well is it catches the ball. So there's more of a deceleration load. There's an impulse into a traction load. There's basically the shoulders getting pulled like this. So the rotator cuff has to stabilize that motion and stabilize earlier to allow him to complete the throw without shoulder pain. And that's one of the reasons that we really like the sock, is that it trains the rotator cuff to contract earlier and a little bit harder. So it's an actual great tool to strengthen the rotator cuff. And what we found is people that have labral pathology and tearing of the labrum in the shoulder do well with it, which is counterintuitive, because you would think labral tearing wouldn't do as well with an added impulse or traction load. And it's interesting, it does the opposite. It actually feels better. And the reason for that is because it teaches the rotator cuff to contract earlier and stabilize that ball and center that ball in the socket. And if it feels better, there's a good indication that it's probably doing something right. So we'll do some positional work, and we can even work into a higher intensity from here. We're not going to today because he's a little fatigued. His body's just generally sore from working out as well. So now we're going to go here, and we'll just work different positions to get him warmed up. We can have him do some full throws as well. One of the things we're working on with Bennett is getting his arm out in front of his body a little bit better. So we'll position there. That's too low. I want to see it go high. Throw it over top of that net. Good. Go. Yep, throw it over the net. So you can actually act like you're long tossing for different biomechanical sequences. Now, I'm not always an advocate of long distance or high arc throwing, where you're throwing it up on a upward trajectory, depending on how the athlete sequences their throw. For Bennett, it may actually work well to get him throwing on a little bit of an upward arc. Okay, now let's see just some full pitches. Where's that release point? Way down. That ball would have spiked the floor. So throw it up here. And that's one of the things we're working on with the throwing sock, is making sure guys can throw a little bit higher with it. Good. Now you got to stabilize the end of your throw. One thing with Bennett is we get him to really modulate how hard he's throwing by using the sock as well. And he likes to work hard. He's a very hard worker. And we just had a talk off camera about making sure we're working smarter, not necessarily always just harder, to make sure he's doing the right things. But the big thing for him is making sure that he can increase his intensity at a reasonable rate. So not going from 0 to 100. And the throwing sock can modulate that pretty well. So now we've turned on the rotator cuff from here. We'll go into some throwing. He's going to do 1 or 2 more with the sock. If you like this video, make sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I want to show you a little bit of what we're doing sometimes with different modalities and different augmented feedback, as well as some intrinsic or implicit learning strategies in combination with some strength assessment and our arm care stuff. So these are all things that we're using in our approach with athletes, and all of them become very important to each fill one slice of the pie. So we will see you guys in the next video. Check out armcare.com. Check out Oats Specialties for the throwing socks.